March 14, 2023, East Texas, approximately 30 miles west of Tyler, a location where oil derricks once dotted the landscape like a mechanical forest, where black gold created fortunes and built empires, where the boom of the 1920s transformed rural farmland into industrial powerhouses. The Anderson refinery complex had been abandoned for nearly 50 years. What had once been a thriving industrial facility processing thousands of barrels of crude oil daily now stood as a rusting monument to a bygone era. The main refinery building, a three-story brick structure built in 1925, loomed over the property. Smaller outbuildings, storage tanks, and the skeletal remains of processing equipment surrounded it. Weeds grew through cracked concrete, windows were broken or missing entirely. The site was fenced off, marked with no trespassing signs, slowly decaying while the modern world moved on around it. In March 2023, the property had been purchased by Lonar Development Corporation, a company specializing in industrial site remediation and redevelopment. Their plan was to demolish the abandoned refinery complex, clean up any remaining environmental contamination, and redevelop the land for commercial use. The site occupied approximately 40 acres in an area that had seen significant growth in decades past, making the land valuable despite its industrial past. Before demolition could begin, structural engineers and environmental specialists needed to survey the property thoroughly. On March 14th, a team led by Robert Martinez, a structural engineer with 25 years of experience in industrial demolition, arrived to conduct a detailed assessment of the main refinery building. The exterior of the building was in poor condition, as expected after decades of abandonment, but it was the interior that proved most interesting. As Robert and his team examined the basement level, comparing the physical structure to architectural blueprints from 1925, they noticed a discrepancy. The blueprints showed a large open basement space used for storage and utilities, but the physical space was smaller than the blueprints indicated. Approximately 20 feet of the basement appeared to be missing. Robert examined the basement walls carefully. On the eastern wall, the brickwork looked different from the rest of the basement. The mortar was a slightly different color. The brick pattern didn't quite match. Someone had built a wall across part of the basement, sealing off a section of the original space. The question was why this wall wasn't part of the original construction. Robert told his assistant, Jennifer Hayes, as they examined the sealed section. Someone bricked this off later, probably in the 20s or 30s based on the mortar style and materials. What's behind it? Standard demolition procedure would be to document the anomaly and proceed with demolition, but Robert's professional curiosity and thoroughness led him to recommend opening the sealed section before demolition. If there were structural issues or environmental hazards behind that wall, they needed to know before bringing the building down. On March 15th, Robert's team carefully removed enough bricks to create an opening into the sealed space. The work was methodical, preserving the structural integrity while creating access. By late morning, they'd created an opening approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet high. Robert shone his flashlight through the opening. The space beyond was pitch black, the air stale and heavy with decades of confinement. The beam revealed a room approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, with a ceiling perhaps 7 feet high. The space appeared to be empty, except for what looked like debris on the floor in the far corner. Robert entered the sealed room carefully, testing the floor and air quality before proceeding. As he approached the corner, his flashlight beam illuminated what the debris actually was. Human skeletal remains, partially covered by deteriorated fabric, lying on the concrete floor as if the person had fallen or been placed there decades ago. Robert immediately withdrew and contacted authorities. By early afternoon, the Gregg County Sheriff's Department had secured the scene. By evening, forensic teams from the Texas Rangers and the State Medical Examiner's Office had arrived. Over the following days, the remains and the sealed room would be carefully examined and documented.
The skeleton was largely complete. Forensic analysis indicated an adult male, likely in his 50s at time of death. Fragments of clothing suggested early 20th century men's business attire. Among the remains were several items that had survived 90 decades in the sealed space. A pocket watch, gold, tarnished but intact, with the initials WJA engraved on the case. A signet ring, also gold, bearing a family crest. The heavily deteriorated remains of what appeared to be a leather wallet, the leather almost entirely decayed, containing corroded metal clasps but no other identifiable contents. After 94 years, historical researchers were immediately brought in. The initials WJA and the location led them to examine records from the Anderson refinery, which had been built and operated by the Anderson family from the 1920s through the 1970s. They found something remarkable, a missing persons case from 1929 involving William James Anderson, the refinery's founder and owner, who had vanished on September 21st of that year and never been found. The identification process would take weeks. Dental records from 1929 were rare, but the Anderson family had been wealthy enough to have comprehensive medical documentation. Historical dental records were located in archived files from a Tyler dentist who'd served the Anderson family. Comparison with the skeletal remains provided a probable match, though after 94 years, certainty through dental records alone was limited. DNA analysis provided more definitive results. Living descendants of William James Anderson were located, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. Genetic comparison confirmed the identification with high probability. The remains were those of William James Anderson, missing for 94 years. Before we continue with this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on September 21, 1929, involves wealth, power, and the cutthroat world of the Texas oil boom. By the end, you'll understand how one of East Texas's most powerful oil men ended up dead in a sealed basement beneath his own refinery, and why it took nearly a century to find him. The questions investigators faced were haunting. Who killed William James Anderson? Why was he hidden in his own facility? And how did a murder at a busy refinery go undetected for 94 years? William James Anderson was 52 years old in September 1929, at the absolute peak of his wealth and influence. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a solid build that had thickened over the years, as wealth allowed him to delegate physical labor. His hair had gone from brown to gray, though he maintained it carefully styled. He wore suits custom-tailored in Dallas, drove a 1928 Cadillac, and lived in a mansion in East Texas that was considered one of the finest homes in East Texas. His presence commanded attention, and those who knew him described him as formidable, a man who dominated any room he entered. William had been born in 1877 in rural East Texas, the son of a small farmer who struggled to make a living from poor soil. William grew up understanding poverty intimately, watching his father work himself into an early grave, trying to farm land that barely produced enough to feed the family. When William's father died in 1892, leaving the family with nothing but debt, 15-year-old William vowed he would never be poor again. He'd received minimal formal education, but William was intelligent and ambitious. At 16, he left home to work in the oil fields that were beginning to develop in East Texas. The late 1890s saw the beginning of Texas's oil boom, and William positioned himself to take advantage. He started as a roughneck, doing dangerous physical labor on drilling rigs. He learned every aspect of oil extraction, processing, and the business side of the industry. By 1900, at age 23, William had saved enough money to purchase a small stake in an oil well. The well struck oil, and William's share was modest but significant. He reinvested every penny, buying stakes in more wells, purchasing drilling equipment, gradually building capital. By 1910, he owned his own drilling operation. By 1915, he'd made his first million. In 1902, William had married Catherine Hayes, the daughter of a Tyler merchant. Their marriage was advantageous for both families. William gained social respectability and connections to East Texas's established business community, while Catherine's family gained ties to the emerging oil wealth. They had 3 children, a son, James,
born in 1903, a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1905, and another son, Thomas, born in 1908. William's greatest achievement came in the 1920s. The East Texas oil boom exploded during that decade, with massive new fields discovered and oil prices reaching heights that created instant fortunes. William, with his years of experience and accumulated capital, was perfectly positioned to capitalize. In 1924, he purchased land and built the Anderson Refinery, a facility designed to process crude oil into gasoline, kerosene, and other petroleum products. The Anderson Refinery became one of the major operations in East Texas. By 1929, it employed over 200 workers, processed thousands of barrels daily, and generated enormous profits. William's wealth grew to an estimated $8 million, equivalent to over $120 million in modern currency. He owned the refinery, held interests in dozens of oil wells, owned commercial properties in Tyler and other Texas cities, and had investments in banks and other businesses. But William's success came with enemies. The oil industry in the 1920s was cutthroat and often violent. Disputes over drilling rights, accusations of claim jumping, conflicts over pipeline access, and competition for refinery contracts created an atmosphere where business rivalries could turn deadly. William had a reputation as ruthless in business dealings. He drove hard bargains, exploited advantages without mercy, and showed little concern for those he outmaneuvered. People respected his success and feared his power, but many also resented him. By 1929, William's business dealings had become increasingly complex, and some whispered increasingly questionable. He was involved in disputes over oil leases. He had conflicts with competitors over pipeline access. Labor organizers were beginning to target his refinery, demanding better wages and working conditions for employees. And there were rumors, never proven but persistent, that William was involved in activities that pushed the boundaries of legality, bribing officials, manipulating contracts, using violence or threats against competitors. The autumn of 1929 was a crucial time in American history, though no one fully understood it yet. The stock market had been rising to unprecedented heights throughout the decade, but cracks were beginning to show. In September 1929, some investors were growing nervous. William James Anderson, with his extensive business interests and investments, would have been watching market conditions carefully. September 21, 1929, was a Saturday. William spent that day at his refinery, as he often did on weekends when business required his attention. He met with several business associates throughout the day, discussing contracts and operations. Multiple employees saw him moving through the facility, inspecting operations, conducting meetings in his office on the 3rd floor of the main building. Around 6 p.m., according to later testimony from employees, William told his staff to go home for the weekend. He said he had a private business meeting scheduled for 6:30 p.m. and wanted the facility cleared. This wasn't unusual. William occasionally held confidential meetings about sensitive business matters. The security guard on duty, a man named Robert Sullivan, later testified that he'd seen William's Cadillac still parked at the refinery around 7 p.m. when Sullivan made his rounds. The main building lights were on, suggesting William was still inside. But when Sullivan checked again around 9 p.m., the lights were off and the building appeared empty. Sullivan assumed William had left and simply forgotten to inform him. Sunday passed. Monday morning, September 23rd, when William didn't arrive at his office at the usual time, his secretary called the Anderson home. Catherine Anderson said she hadn't seen her husband since Saturday morning when he'd left for the refinery.
She'd assumed he'd stayed at the refinery working late and perhaps stayed overnight in the apartment he maintained there for convenience, but he'd never stayed overnight without calling her. By Monday afternoon, family and business associates were concerned. By Monday evening, the Gregg County Sheriff was investigating, and by Tuesday morning, it was clear something was terribly wrong. William James Anderson, one of East Texas's most powerful men, had vanished without a trace. September 21, 1929, a Saturday afternoon at the Anderson Refinery in East Texas. The facility was operating at reduced capacity over the weekend with minimal staff present. The main refinery building, which housed offices, a laboratory, and some processing equipment, was where William James Anderson spent most of his time during these weekend visits. Throughout that Saturday, several employees saw William and spoke with him. His secretary, Margaret Wilson, was working that morning to finish some correspondence. She later told investigators that William had seemed preoccupied, but not unusually so. He'd received several telephone calls during the morning, and she'd overheard parts of conversations that suggested business matters, possibly disputes or negotiations of some kind. Around noon, William met with Thomas Clark, one of his drilling supervisors, to discuss production rates from several wells the Anderson operation controlled. Clark later testified that the meeting was routine, that William had been his usual self, demanding, detail-oriented, focused on maximizing profits. Nothing about William's demeanor suggested any problems or concerns. At approximately 2 p.m., William met with Daniel Martinez, a business associate who owned drilling equipment that Anderson's operation leased. They discussed contract terms for the coming year. Martinez later told investigators that William had driven a hard bargain, as always, but the meeting had been cordial. Martinez left the refinery around 3 p.m., shaking hands with William in the main building lobby. Between 3 and 6 p.m., several other employees saw William moving through the facility. He inspected some processing equipment, checked inventory in one of the storage areas, and returned to his office on the third floor to work on paperwork. At approximately 5:45 p.m., William emerged from his office and spoke with the few remaining employees. He told them he was expecting a visitor for a private business meeting and that they should go home for the weekend. He thanked them for their work and said he'd see them Monday morning. By 6:15 p.m., the refinery was essentially empty except for William and Robert Sullivan, the security guard. Sullivan's job was to patrol the property throughout the night, checking for fires, unauthorized access, or other security issues. He'd worked for Anderson for 5 years and knew the routine well. Sullivan later provided detailed testimony about that evening. At 6:30 p.m., he'd been near the main gate when he saw a vehicle enter the property. The light was fading, and Sullivan couldn't identify the vehicle type or see the driver clearly. The vehicle drove toward the main building and parked near the entrance. Sullivan assumed this was William's expected visitor. He didn't investigate further, as William had made clear he wanted privacy for his meeting. Around 7 p.m., Sullivan made his regular rounds of the property. He walked past the main building and noted that lights were on in the third-floor office area and in the basement. This seemed normal. William's Cadillac was still parked in its usual spot. The other vehicle he'd seen arrive was also still there, though Sullivan couldn't later provide a detailed description beyond saying it had been a dark-colored sedan. Sullivan continued his rounds, checking the various outbuildings and storage areas. At approximately 8:30 p.m., he returned to the vicinity of the main building. The lights were now off. Both William's Cadillac and the visitor's vehicle were gone. Sullivan assumed the meeting had concluded and both men had left. But this is where the timeline becomes murky and troubling. What Sullivan didn't know was that William's Cadillac hadn't left. It would be found the next day, Monday, parked behind one of the storage buildings where it wasn't visible from the main gate or Sullivan's usual patrol route. The car was locked, with William's keys still in the ignition. His briefcase was on the back seat, containing business documents and a substantial amount of cash, approximately $2,000, money William had withdrawn from the bank on Friday. The investigation into William James Anderson's disappearance began immediately on Monday, September 23rd, when it became clear he hadn't simply gone away for the weekend. Sheriff James Wilson personally led the investigation, given William's prominence in the community. The Anderson refinery was searched thoroughly. Every building, every storage area, every piece of equipment large enough to conceal a person was examined. Investigators found William's office on the third floor of the
main building, seemingly undisturbed. His desk contained business papers, financial documents, correspondence. Nothing appeared to be missing or out of place. The basement of the main building was searched, but investigators found only what they expected: storage areas, utility equipment, empty spaces used for various industrial purposes. No one noticed that the basement was smaller than the architectural blueprints indicated. The wall that had been built to seal off a section of the basement looked like it had always been there. Without blueprints to compare against, there was no reason to suspect anything unusual about the basement's configuration. William's Cadillac, found behind a storage building, was examined carefully. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. The car was simply parked and locked, as if William had left it there intentionally. But why park it behind the storage building instead of in his usual spot? And if he'd parked it there, how had he left the refinery property? The investigation quickly focused on several theories. Kidnapping. Given William's wealth, kidnapping for ransom seemed possible, but no ransom demand ever materialized. Days passed, then weeks, with no contact from anyone claiming to hold William or demanding money. Without a ransom demand, kidnapping seemed unlikely. Business rivals. The oil industry was violent and competitive. Perhaps a business rival had decided to eliminate William. But who? And how would they have done it at William's own refinery? Investigators looked into William's various business disputes and conflicts. Several names emerged as people who had reasons to resent or even hate William. All were investigated. All had alibis for September 21st, or claimed to. None could be definitively connected to the disappearance. Voluntary disappearance. Perhaps William had chosen to disappear. But why? His business was thriving, his family life was stable, he had wealth, power, respect. What would motivate him to walk away from everything? Some speculated he might have been involved in illegal activities and fled to avoid prosecution, but no evidence of such activities was found. Others suggested romantic entanglements or secret financial problems, but again, no evidence supported these theories. The mysterious visitor. The most tantalizing clue was the visitor Sullivan had seen arrive around 6:30 p.m. Who was this person? What was the nature of the private meeting William had mentioned? Sullivan's description was frustratingly vague. A dark sedan, couldn't identify make or model, couldn't describe the driver. Investigators tried to identify who William might have been meeting. They examined his business correspondence, his telephone records, his appointment books. No scheduled meeting appeared in any of his records. The investigation interviewed everyone who'd been at the refinery on September 21st. All confirmed the same basic timeline. All confirmed William had asked them to leave by 6 p.m. None could identify who he might have been meeting. Margaret Wilson, his secretary, said she hadn't scheduled any meeting for that evening and knew of none planned. If William had arranged a meeting, he'd done so personally, without involving his staff. As weeks became months, the investigation continued, but produced no breakthroughs. William James Anderson had simply vanished. His family held out hope that he might be found alive, perhaps suffering from amnesia or held somewhere against his will. But as months turned to years, hope faded. In October 1929, barely a month after William's disappearance, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. The economic catastrophe that followed consumed public attention. William's disappearance, while still discussed locally, became just another unsolved mystery overshadowed by national crisis.
The Anderson refinery continued operating. Catherine Anderson, William's wife, took nominal control with the help of their son, James, now 26 years old and experienced in the business. The refinery survived the Depression and continued operating through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. But without William's driving force and business acumen, it gradually declined. In 1936, 7 years after his disappearance, William James Anderson was declared legally dead. This allowed his estate to be settled and his family to move forward. His wealth was divided among his wife and children. The refinery became a family operation, though it would never again reach the heights it had achieved under William's leadership. By the 1970s, the Anderson refinery was no longer economically viable. Larger, more modern facilities had made it obsolete. In 1976, the refinery ceased operations. The equipment was sold or scrapped. The property was left to decay, too contaminated and complicated to redevelop easily. And in the basement of the main building, behind a brick wall built in September 1929, William James Anderson's remains lay undiscovered, waiting nearly a century to tell their story. The 94 years between William James Anderson's disappearance in 1929 and the discovery of his remains in 2023 saw transformations that would have been unimaginable to someone living in the oil boom days of the 1920s. The Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Space Age, the Computer Revolution, the Internet. The world changed completely while William's remains lay hidden beneath his own refinery. The Anderson family continued through the decades. Catherine Anderson, William's wife, lived until 1958, dying at age 79 without ever knowing what happened to her husband. She'd spent nearly 30 years widowed, always wondering, never finding answers. James Anderson, their oldest son, managed what remained of the family business interests until his death in 1973. Elizabeth and Thomas, the other children, eventually moved away from Texas, though they maintained some connection to the area. By 2023, the Anderson family's direct connection to East Texas had largely faded. The descendants, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of William and Catherine, were scattered across the country. Many didn't even know the full story of their ancestors' mysterious disappearance. It had become family history, a curious footnote about the oil baron great-grandfather who'd vanished in 1929. The abandoned Anderson refinery became a local landmark, though not in any positive sense. The site sat empty for decades, fenced off, marked with warnings about contamination and structural hazards. Teenagers occasionally broke in to explore the ruins, though most found the place more sad than exciting. The massive tanks and processing equipment rusted away. Buildings collapsed or stood in increasingly dangerous states of decay. Nature slowly reclaimed the property, vegetation growing through concrete and around rusting metal. Over the decades, various companies and developers considered purchasing the property for redevelopment, but the environmental cleanup required was expensive, and the property's history made it less attractive. Several times in the 1990s and 2000s, the property changed hands, with new owners having grand plans that never materialized. The mysterious visitor was not finalized and was subject to change. Deadlines were extended, budgets were altered, and by the time demolition was finally scheduled, it was already October 2023. Robert Martinez and his team had a comprehensive plan for demolition. They would begin with the outer buildings, storage tanks and processing equipment, working their way inward toward the main building, which was the oldest and most structurally complicated. Each demolition was carefully controlled, with safety measures in place to protect workers and minimize the environmental impact. During the initial clearing phases, the company encountered considerable environmental hazards. Soil and groundwater were heavily contaminated with petroleum and heavy metals. The company implemented extensive measures to contain and treat these contaminants, following strict regulations set forth by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. March 12, 2023. A few weeks before the discovery, a local historian named Sarah Hearn, a native of the East Texas area, reached out to Lone Star Development and requested she be allowed to explore the refinery site one last time before it was demolished. She explained that she was working on a book on the history of East Texas and wanted to document the abandoned refinery before it was gone. The developers initially hesitated, citing safety concerns, but Hearn persisted, emphasizing that she was experienced in documenting historical sites and would take all necessary precautions, offering to sign all liability waivers. Reluctantly, they agreed to allow a limited visit, under the strict supervision of Martinez and his team. In late February 2023, the arrangement was finalized. The visit was scheduled for March 14, 2023.
We're conducting the final detailed survey of the main refinery building before demolition. The three-story brick structure was the largest building on the property and would be the most challenging to demolish safely. Robert had obtained copies of the original 1925 architectural blueprints from county records. He was comparing the blueprints to the actual structure, noting changes, deterioration, and potential hazards. On the basement level, he noticed a discrepancy. The blueprints showed a large open space, approximately 50 feet by 30 feet, but when Robert measured the actual basement, it was only about 30 feet by 30 feet. 20 feet of the basement's original length was missing. "There's a wall here that shouldn't be," Robert explained to his assistant, Jennifer Hayes, as they stood in the basement, examining the eastern wall. "The blueprints show this basement extending another 20 feet east. Someone sealed off a section." Jennifer examined the wall closely. "The brickwork doesn't match the rest of the basement," she observed. "Look at the mortar color and the laying pattern. This wall was definitely added later." Robert photographed the wall and documented the discrepancy. His professional judgment told him this needed to be investigated before demolition. If there were structural issues, environmental hazards, or hidden utilities behind that wall, the demolition team needed to know about them. He contacted Lonier Development's project manager and recommended opening the sealed section before proceeding with demolition. The manager agreed, authorizing Robert to carefully breach the wall to examine what was behind it. On March 15th, Robert's team began carefully removing bricks from the center of the wall. The work was slow and methodical, with constant attention to structural stability. By late morning, they'd created an opening large enough to see through. Robert aimed his flashlight into the darkness beyond. The beam revealed a room that had been completely sealed for decades. The air that escaped was stale, heavy with the smell of mold and decay. The flashlight beam showed a concrete floor, brick walls, a low ceiling with exposed pipes and conduits, and in the far corner what appeared to be a pile of debris or discarded materials. Robert entered the sealed room cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he approached the corner, the pile of debris revealed itself as something far more significant: human skeletal remains lying on the floor, partially covered by the remnants of deteriorated clothing. Robert immediately backed out of the room and called the authorities. The Gregg County Sheriff's Department responded within an hour. By afternoon, the site was secured as a potential crime scene. By evening, a full forensic team had arrived. The forensic examination of the sealed room took several days. The remains were carefully documented in place before being removed. The position of the body suggested the person had either been placed in the room or had died there and collapsed to the floor. The remains were mostly complete, though some smaller bones were scattered. The clothing had deteriorated significantly after 94 years, but fragments remained that suggested early 20th century men's business attire. Buttons, a belt buckle, remnants of leather shoes. The materials and style were consistent with clothing from the 1920s or 30s. Several personal items had survived better than the fabric and leather. A pocket watch, gold, with minimal corrosion due to the sealed, relatively dry environment. When carefully cleaned, engraving on the case became visible: WJA and the date 1905. A signet ring, gold, bearing a family crest with initials A incorporated into the key design. The heavily deteriorated remains of a wallet,
the leather almost entirely decayed, containing only corroded metal clasps. Any paper contents had disintegrated completely over 94 years. The forensic examination of the skeletal remains provided crucial information. The individual was male, approximately 50 to 55 years old at time of death, height estimated at approximately 6'2". The skull showed evidence of significant trauma, fractures on the right side, consistent with at least 2 heavy blows from a blunt object. This trauma would have been immediately fatal or near fatal. There were no other significant injuries, suggesting death came from the head trauma. Historical research began immediately. The initials WJA on the pocket watch combined with the
location led researchers to examine records from the Anderson refinery. The connection to William James Anderson was obvious. Cross-referencing with the 1929 missing person case confirmed the likelihood. This was William James Anderson, missing for 94 years. Dental records from 1929 were located through persistent historical research. William Anderson had received dental work from a prominent Tyler dentist in the 1920s. That dentist's practice records had been archived and were still accessible. Comparison with the skeletal remains showed several distinctive features that matched, providing strong supporting evidence for the identification. For definitive confirmation, DNA analysis was conducted. Descendants of William James Anderson were located and contacted. Several agreed to provide DNA samples. Genetic analysis comparing the skeletal remains to samples from known descendants provided conclusive identification. The remains were those of William James Anderson. The sealed room's construction was also examined. The wall that had concealed the room showed evidence of having been built in the late 1920s or early 1930s, consistent with the time period of William's disappearance. The brickwork and mortar matched materials that would have been used in that era. Someone had built that wall specifically to hide the room and its contents, then sealed it so effectively that it went undiscovered for nearly a century. The discovery of William James Anderson's remains 94 years after his disappearance answered the question of what happened to him, but raised many others about who killed him and why. After nearly a century, forensic evidence was extremely limited in what it could reveal about the circumstances of his murder and concealment. Most of what follows is informed speculation based on skeletal evidence, historical records, and logical inference, not proven facts. What investigators could determine from physical evidence. William James Anderson died on or very shortly after September 21, 1929. The skeletal remains showed no evidence of surviving beyond that time period. He died from blunt force trauma to the skull, at least 2 heavy blows to the head that would have been immediately fatal. He was killed, and his body was placed in what became his tomb, a section of the refinery basement that was then sealed with a brick wall. The cause of death was clear from the skeletal evidence. The manner of death was obviously homicide. What remained uncertain after 94 years was who committed the murder and why. After nearly a century, absolute certainty about the killer's identity was impossible. Everyone present at the refinery on September 21, 1929, was long dead. Physical evidence beyond the skeletal remains was minimal, but investigators and forensic historians examined available evidence to construct the most probable explanation. Several factors pointed toward the likely scenario. The crime occurred at Williams' own refinery, in a basement area that wasn't publicly accessible. The killer had to have access to the facility and knowledge of the basement layout. The construction of the wall to seal the room required time, materials, and expertise. Someone couldn't have done this quickly or without being noticed unless they had legitimate reasons to be working in the building. The timing was significant. William sent all his employees home on the evening of September 21st, saying he had a private meeting scheduled. The security guard saw a vehicle arrive around 6:30 p.m. Investigators theorized that William was killed during or shortly after that meeting. The visitor William met with that evening is considered the most likely suspect, though after 94 years, this remains speculation rather than proven fact. The sealed room's construction would have required several hours of work, possibly extending into Sunday or Monday. Whoever built that wall needed access to the refinery, construction materials, and enough time to complete the work without interruption. This suggested either someone who worked at the refinery or someone with the authority to be there without question. The most likely theory based on available evidence and historical context, William James Anderson was probably killed by someone he knew and trusted enough to meet privately. Investigators believe the meeting on September 21st was likely about business matters, possibly a deal, a dispute, or a negotiation. During that meeting, something
went catastrophically wrong. The skeletal evidence shows William died from at least 2 blows to the head with a blunt object, possibly a tool or implement available in an industrial setting, though the exact circumstances leading to the violence cannot be determined after 94 years. What happened after William's death remains largely speculation. The body was hidden in a section of the basement and a wall was built to conceal the space. This would have required several hours of work and access to construction materials. The person responsible either had legitimate access to the refinery or was able to work undetected during the weekend. The construction of the wall suggests some level of planning or at least quick thinking under pressure, but the exact sequence of events and the killer's thought process are impossible to reconstruct with certainty. Who specifically was the killer? Several categories of suspects were possible. A business rival who'd arranged the meeting to negotiate or threaten William, then killed him in a confrontation that escalated. Someone who worked at the refinery who had both access and knowledge of the facility's layout. An employee with construction skills who could have built the wall. A business associate or partner who'd been involved in questionable dealings with William and needed to eliminate him. The mysterious visitor the security guard saw arrive around 6:30 p.m. but couldn't describe in detail. After 94 years, identifying the specific individual was impossible. Everyone involved was deceased. Records that might have provided clues were lost or destroyed. The complete truth went to the grave with the killer decades ago. The timing of William's murder, occurring just weeks before the October 1929 stock market crash, added an element of historical irony. Some speculated that William might have had foreknowledge of the coming financial disaster, and the murder might have been related to attempts to manipulate markets or secure assets before the crash. But no evidence supported such speculation. The discovery brought a form of closure to William James Anderson's descendants. His great-great-grandchildren, who'd grown up knowing the family legend about the oil baron ancestor who mysteriously vanished, finally had answers about what happened to him, if not why or by whom. In April 2023, William James Anderson's remains were released to his family. On April 30th, he was buried in a Tyler cemetery in a plot next to Catherine Anderson, his wife, who died in 1958. The gravestone acknowledged his life and the mystery that had finally been solved. William James Anderson, 1877 to 1929, lost for 94 years, finally laid to rest. The Anderson refinery property demolition proceeded as planned after the forensic investigation concluded. By summer 2023, the abandoned structures were being dismantled. The site where William's body had been hidden for nearly a century was just one more section of concrete and brick reduced to rubble and hauled away. By late 2023, the property was cleared, ready for the next chapter in its history. So what really happened to William James Anderson? Based on skeletal evidence, we know he died from blunt force trauma to the head on or shortly after September 21, 1929. We know his body was hidden in a sealed basement room beneath his own refinery. We know the concealment was effective enough to go undetected for 94 years.
But the critical questions, who killed him? What precisely happened during that final meeting? What motivated the violence? These remain speculation built on circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. After nearly a century, with everyone involved long dead and most physical evidence deteriorated or lost, these details cannot be determined with certainty. The story of William James Anderson reminds us that wealth and power provide no protection against violence, that crimes can remain hidden for generations through clever concealment, that technology and chance can eventually reveal secrets that seemed permanently buried, that historical mysteries sometimes find partial resolution even after nearly a century, and that in the competitive, often violent world of the oil boom era, fortunes could be won or lost, and lives could end suddenly, with truth becoming just another casualty of ambition and greed. Rest in peace, William James Anderson. Your empire crumbled, your wealth passed to others, but your story has finally been told, incomplete as it is.